Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar on the unexpected drivers of waste in clinical manufacturing. As you might know, this is the second webinar in a series of webinars focusing on waste, with the first one that took place in February was focusing actually on clinical trial supply chain drug waste. And today we're going to look at the more upstream side of the supply chain and really look at the manufacturing. So I am Amory. I will be the moderator of today's webinar. Before we get started, let me give you some indications on how to use this platform, Demio, on which the webinar will be taking place today. You will see that you have multiple options. So let's start with the top right side of your screen, where you will have access to the chats, the polls, or handouts. In the chat, feel free to ask any questions that you have throughout the webinar. We'll make sure to answer them at the very end, where we will have a Q&A session. Throughout the webinar, we'll also be sending out some polls. Don't worry, you will get an alert as soon as one of them appears on your screen. You may also use some buttons on the top right of your screen to put your page into full screen, as well as change some parameters like the size of the camera, or to reduce or increase the size of the chat area. If you have any questions, feel free to send a message to Domenica, who will be there to help you in case you have any technical difficulties today. And before we get started, let me just give you a very quick introduction to Enside for those who don't know our company. So Enside is an innovative software company and consulting company. We've actually been developing optimization solutions, especially focusing in the life sciences industry and in the clinical trials industry. We've developed risk-based optimization solutions for clinical trial supply chain and manufacturing. And as you can see on the slide, we've had quite a growth in the past couple of years. We've now reached more than 150 employees globally and have 2 offices, one in Belgium, one in the United States. We've also been working with a lot of different partners in the industry, amongst them 50% of the top 20 pharmaceutical companies in the world, and have been able to optimize more than 10,000 clinical trials over the past couple of years. And it is really based on that experience that we're going to share our knowledge today with you. Because by optimizing that many clinical trials and that many programs, we were able to really identify what are the main drivers of drug waste in the whole end-to-end clinical trial supply chain. But we'll get into that in a minute. Let me introduce you to your speakers today. So we're going to have Cyrille Lefèvre, who is our senior expert and our product business owner at Enside. He is quite the expert in manufacturing optimization, as he's handled a lot of these projects over the past couple of years, as he's been at Enside actually for 8 years now. And we'll have Pauline Deplasse, our head of life sciences user engagement, also an expert in manufacturing optimization for the R&D. She's been at Enside for the past 4 years and has handled really a lot of projects and programs in manufacturing. So I'll leave the floor to you guys, and have a great webinar, everyone.
Thank you very much, Amory, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're really glad to have this webinar today with everyone. So let me just walk you through the agenda so you know what to expect over the next half an hour at least. We'll be, first of all, introducing waste and what we mean by waste in the clinical supply chain. Then we'll go into the drivers of waste that we've tried to place into different categories. For each of these categories, we're going to present a case study coming from our experience with some of our pharma or biotech partners. Then we'll conclude, and after the conclusion, there will be time left for a Q&A. So if at any point in this presentation you have questions, do not hesitate to type them in the chat. We'll be happy to take them at the end and answer all of this. So let's get started. We are working in an industry where it all starts with the patients. So in terms of clinical trial planning, it starts with the patients. We're looking at how much demand these patients need, and that's when we start retro planning. So how much IMP do the patients need, adding an overage to that, what DP do we need to be able to satisfy this, and then what DS do we need to plan. So it goes in one direction, but what's interesting is that the actual flow of materials, the goods, are running in the other direction. So we have a lot of different constraints or processes that are in place in the manufacturing or through the distribution that don't necessarily allow to answer the patient demand in the most straightforward way, the most efficient way. So we're always, when we're trying to plan on how to supply a clinical trial and how to manufacture to satisfy the demand, we're always looking at a balance in between the risk that we absolutely want to avoid. We never want to miss a patient dose, but we want to do that in the most effective, efficient manner and really trying to minimize as much as possible the waste. So in order to find that balance, it's really important when we're planning to take into consideration all of the different aspects from manufacturing through distribution to the patient journey in the clinical trial, because all these pieces have impacts on the decisions that you need to take, and they're all interconnected. So this is going to be the red line a little bit of our presentation. And let's take a look at what we mean by that waste that we want to minimize. So waste, if we want to define it, it's all of the unnecessary expenses or activities that are not done bringing direct value to the patient. So here we could see it as all of the drug that's manufactured and not being dispensed to patients. We're all working in the clinical trial industry. We know it's not that easy because in terms of everything that is manufactured, of course, there's a certain type of necessary waste. There's a lot of uncertainty that needs to be covered. So I'm taking examples such as you need buffers at the sites or at the depots, but even if in the manufacturing part, you need some stock to be able to do some quality testing. And that has perhaps indirect value for patients, but a lot of value for patients. So in terms of everything that's manufactured, a part is directly dispensed to the patient. That's the demand. Then we have, let's call it an operational demand. It's that necessary waste that has indirect value for the patient. And then we have, let's call it the pure waste. It's all of the drug that's unallocated, but that's not necessarily bringing any value at all. And that part is really what, over the years and the projects with our customers, we've tried to reduce. What's also important is that one compound is not the other, one project is not the other. The numbers that we're going to be talking about, the scales are all very different. There's no one size fits all. And I'd like to start with a little bit of a poll before we go into these numbers I'm talking about. And I will let my colleague, the moderator, Amaury, launch the poll. It would appear on the right side of your screen. We would like to ask you, in your opinion and out of your experience, what do you think is, if you look at all of the drug substance that is manufactured, the amount of drug that actually never makes it to the patient, that's never going to be dispensed to a patient on average across the industry? So I see the first people answering. Thank you. So we have a clear lead on 50 to 75% at the moment. I'll give a couple of extra seconds. All right, so overall, 75% of the audience thinks that 50 to 75% of the drug substance never reaches the patients. Well, you might actually be surprised, but the average industry waste levels at the moment are actually of about 85%. So it's really high. It means that out of everything that is manufactured, only 15% ultimately reaches the patients. Now, in these 85%, some of it is absolutely necessary. But what we'd like also to cover is, as Amaury mentioned, we've worked on a lot of different trials and programs over the last couple of years. And with our partners, we've identified that from 30 to 50% of those 85 are waste that can actually be avoided. There's different decisions that are made where the impact of that decisions, it's not necessarily assessed. The decisions are not made knowingly. There's also there's also different buffers that are taken because there's uncertainty in terms of the assumptions that we're working on, and so on and so on. So that's a little bit what we're going to be covering a little bit more into the details today. And for that, I will leave the floor to Cyrille.
Thanks. So the first step here in understanding waste and where it's coming from in clinical supply chain is to put a little bit of structure. And so to kick it off, before we actually get into the specifics of the classifications that we have at Insight have built, we would like to first get your opinion. So if you could go and into the chat and answer the following questions. So in your opinion, in your experience, what are the most common drivers of drug waste in clinical trial supply? So if you had to make a guess of why are we in a situation where we only have 15% of all the DS manufacture that actually makes it to the patients, what are the few factors that you would point to as being the main drivers of that waste? So is it inaccuracy of clinical assumptions? Is it just the processes that are too complex for us to be able to do any better? Is it a lack of communication? What in your opinion could it be? I see some people sharing about the accuracy of the enrollment, which is definitely a good one. And I think clinical assumptions in general are not always making our life any easier in coming up with an accurate plan. Availability of clinical trial information, local depot, more clinical enrollments, that seems to be a big one. Anyone have anything else that they want to share there? The really good news is that all of this is very much aligned with the classification that we have built. So we'll be able to hopefully answer quite a few of those, put a little bit of structure around all of this. So we at Insight categorize these sources of waste into 4 main categories. And what we'll do is just go through each individual ones, give you a few pointers about that category, as well as a case study highlighting how we at Insight recommend that you tackle it and how we can also help you tackle that situation and hopefully bring your waste levels down from where they are right now. So the 4 categories are demand. So Pauline already hinted to it. That's where it all starts, is understanding how much drug your patients and your trials will actually need. For those of you that are aware of Insight, you know that that's where we started with this foundational layer of understanding what is the demand of individual clinical trials. And it's definitely one of the keys to bringing your waste levels down. The second major source of waste in clinical manufacturing are the processes themselves. And so we'll be going into this a little bit further about how understanding how processes drive the waste up is an important factor in discussions, for example, with your commercial colleagues that definitely do not have the same variability built into their processes. The third one is the planning itself. So spending enough time planning, getting ready before the start of a program, make sure that you have something that you can easily readjust is definitely a key piece to it, obviously. Again, part of the DNA of Insight. And the fourth major source of waste in clinical supplies is what we call siloed decision making. So people are receiving data from someone else, making computation, then just passing that on to the next person without much context, and so on with 3 or 4 intermediate people. And in the end, everyone has only a fragmented vision of reality that is not helping with reaching a global optimal in terms of waste. So we'll be going through each of them, but to kick it off, let's start off with the demand side of things. So demand planning for clinical supplies is has always been and probably always will be a complex thing to do. First, the list of trials is constantly evolving. It's very hard to get a clear picture of what the pipeline looks like in terms of trials and get accurate information. It was definitely brought up by John in the chat earlier of understanding what clinical has in mind can be a challenge. Second thing is we see that clinical trials are definitely not getting simpler, right? So we're building protocols that are more and more patient-centric, have more and more potential endpoints, and can lead to vastly different outcomes in terms of drug need, which makes the planning a lot harder. And then once in a while, and pretty frequently in the last few years, we have a pandemic show up, the Brexit, things that are just there to keep our life interesting. And so that's just the world that we live in, and that we have to realize that we live in and account for in our planning and make sure that we are ready to cover all of these uncertainty. But even knowing that, the planning accuracy is still the major factor of waste in all of this, of people being overcautious or feeling like they have to be overcautious to be able to supply their trials in a safe enough way. And so that's the part that we're going to be, well, as you know, this is our expertise, and we want to show you a few pointers as to how this can be done. So we did a quick poll as part of this case study with one of our big pharma partners of why did they think that they had such inaccurate forecasts. So we looked back at old studies, realized that in their case, 60 to 75% of all IMP packaged never made it in the hands of patients. And why is that? And so obviously we have these inaccurate data forecasts. What came up, trials are complex. We need overage to be able to account for that. There's many pieces of information that need to fit together one way or another, different people having different pieces of information, and it being very hard to merge all of that together. Uncertainty obviously came up there. And in the end, what it all boiled down to is what type of overage do we need to ensure that we're able to successfully supply our trial. Let's face it, coming up with a patient demand, it's not the easiest thing to do, but if you're just looking for your average patient demand, it's not that hard to do. The complex part is factoring in all this variability and understanding what type of overage you would need to be sure that you can cover that uncertainty. And it's not a one size fits all. We're in no way saying that it's a trivial thing to do, but it's definitely something that can be done. And so we did a lot of analysis with that pharma partner and realized and were able over a few years of bringing their drug needs. So this, what was perceived as needs initially, so this patient demand plus overage, we were able to bring that down on average by 50%. And again, knowing that the studies are getting more complex, things are more and more dynamic, was definitely a pretty big success for them. And why is that? And let's try to visualize that with a little bit, one concrete example of one of their programs. I won't be getting into too much detail about the program itself, but all you need to know is there were only 3 trials, so it's a pretty small program at the time, nothing too crazy. And so we built this type of supply versus needs curve. That's a very commercial supply chain type of graph for those of you that haven't seen it, where here in blue you have the needs, so the demand in terms of IMP for the different studies, and then in gray you have the supply where you can see your different batches coming in at different points in time. And so what it boiled down to is this graph on the right that is very similar to what Pauline just showed you, where you have your 3 trials with a given demand and then some additional buffer built on top. Again, probably what you would expect from the supply of a clinical program and nothing to worry about too much there. But then we did a little bit of digging and looked at each of these 3 trials individually and tried to figure out whether there was something that could be done in a more efficient way to ensure that on the manufacturing side, things rolled a little bit smoother. And even we were actually pretty surprised of the outcome on this particular one. For these pretty small trials, easy to forecast, we realized that each of the individual study managers there first didn't have the right tools to be able to forecast. So they went really high level, really conservative in coming up with their demand. Second, they didn't have a lot of oversight on how much overage or a lot of guidelines of how much overage was needed. So they went with something that they felt would be comfortable for them. And so what we obviously did is came in with our tools and said, look, this is what you actually need as overage. And we brought the program down here, in this case, down by 47%. So the total demand was down to 53% from its initial value, just in optimizing these 3 studies. As you can imagine, decreasing by that much meant that it freed up a whole lot of capacity that they could then either reuse for other programs, reuse to start more trials, accelerate the trials that they had ongoing. It was definitely very exciting for them to do. And so here during this webinar, we're really focused on the waste, more on the upstream part. So we already had this first webinar that was focused on the waste on individual trials. If you're interested in that part, I would definitely encourage you to go and have a look at that webinar. It was definitely going into a lot more details of that part of it, but we really wanted to make that link between waste on the manufacturing side and the inaccuracy of the demand, and because that's really where it all starts. And if you don't do a good job there, you can put as much effort on improving your processes upstream, you'll still end up with very significant waste down the line. So this is where it all starts, and this is our first main driver of waste for this webinar.
Thank you, Cyrille. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about the processes when we're taking a step back from the actual patient demand. So we are all working in development processes. So, well, there's a lot of uncertainty. When we're in early stage development, we don't know what the yield is going to be. So exactly how much drug we're actually going to end up having in the batch that we're currently manufacturing. The stability plan and stability testing results are also uncertain. Approvals. So right now, what we need to do is really start with our best guesses, but it's also really important to stress test, perhaps play and work with different scenarios so that we can have a strategy that's covering different types of possibilities. What we've also seen from the different partners that we work with is that more and more the supply chains are becoming very complex. The screenshot that you can see below on the slide here is representing the manufacturing network of one of our partners. So they have manufacturing resources all across the world, and they're shared across programs. There's competition between the resources. I think if I give you the example of another one of our partners, they're working with the CMO with very defined time slot that they need to book a year in advance. So there's limited resources that are shared amongst different things. There's a bit of competition. There's uncertainty, and all of this kind of makes the different manufacturing steps very long. So we have to make decisions on all of that very long in advance. And it's very, very important in this context to be able to have tools, ways to identify what are your bottlenecks so that you know where to act on and which smart investments to make so that you can become more efficient. So bottlenecks are important. It's also really important to build as much flexibility as possible into the different decisions that you're making within your process. I'll go into a quick case study in a moment, but really, what we've seen really valuable for a lot of the partners that we worked with is, instead of accepting the information that you receive as the status quo and working with it, challenging the information you receive, asking questions like, why is it that way? Do we really have to do it that way? Can I try and assess the impact of this decision before moving on and planning by integrating all of these constraints is really important. So we'll get back to that a little bit later, but really that challenging the status quo, asking questions and communicating with other teams is also something that's bringing a lot of value. So we wanted to show you a very quick case study, and here's the introduction. So the graph you can see here on your screen is basically the demand forecasted for a program with 13 different trials. So all of the trials are represented by a different color. And what's really interesting to see here is that, well, the demand is really not linear. There's peaks and drops. And since they had 13 different trials, this particular company that we worked with, they had 2 manufacturing lines, a large one and a small one. And their gut feeling when they started planning this is, hey, we're going to use the large line and use the largest lot size to manufacture the entire program, since it's such a large one. And we kind of took a look at what that would give. So we see that the demand was very variable over time. And what we ended up seeing is that in order to get lots that have a good enough expiry to support all of the study demands, it wasn't always possible to group these demands into large lots. If you were grouping demands into large lots, they would end up sometimes expiring before you could allocate the remaining drug substance to the different trials. So using only the largest line and the largest lot size led in their case to lots being poorly allocated and quite some waste. And that's something that we've seen just not with this pharma partner, but other of our partners, is that lot sizing and keeping flexibility in that is really key to avoid waste. So here in this case, they decided to use both the small and the big lines over time, depending exactly on what the demand was and what the shelf life that they had available was, so that they could really tailor the lot size to this. This is something that is always going to be very interesting to reduce the waste. Having one size fits all is not something that is always working. And in the case of this particular case study, going from the low flexibility of using only one line and one lot size to adding more flexibility in this planning, reduced the amount of API by 31 kilograms, which for this program amounted to 1 million. Again, there's different scales of programs, so you can imagine the impact that it could have for yours. If I go a little bit more into the detail, this graph here, it starts with the green line is showing the cumulative demand over time. And we really came up with a recommendation. You see a couple of blue bars at the bottom of the graph. These are the lots and the size and when they need to be manufactured. The blue line then basically computes the amount of inventory that you would have as a result and the supply that you need to do. What we can see is we really had a lot of variability in terms of the lot size that was found as the most optimal. And towards the end of the time horizon, it was really worth using the smaller line for one lot. And it came to a solution here with a very high allocation ratio, meaning that close to everything that was supplied was actually allocated to a study. There's still a very small drop at some point where a part of the drug expired, but it's really something that we tried to minimize over the entire time horizon. Now, what was also very interesting in this project is we did the analysis for the active product, but we also did it for the placebo product. And for the placebo product, the drug was way less expensive, and the fixed costs of starting the manufacture of a new lot were actually much higher than the fact that we would have drug that would be wasted. So the solution we came up with here in exactly the same program for the placebo is a little bit different. We're also using the same smaller line towards the end of the time horizon. But we could have had more frequent smaller lots, but from a cost perspective here, it didn't make much sense. So we come with a solution with a little bit of a lower allocation for the placebo. And what we always try to do when we work with our customers on these types of projects is to try and be as efficient as possible, as effective and lower the waste, but also not doing that in a risky way. So we're always building as much margin in terms of time as possible. If we take the example of where I have my little arrow in the middle of the screen, this is showing that if we have a couple of months of delay in the manufacturing of one of our lots, it doesn't have any impact on our needs and on our patients ultimately. So sometimes having also tools where you can visualize how many months you have at hand, what's a little bit the safety of your strategy, is something that we've seen lacking, and it also contributes to that mindset of, I'm not 100% sure if what I'm working with is okay. I don't want to become a bottleneck myself, so I'm adding an extra overage. So adding transparency and so on into the process is really important. And so I'll end this. We'll no one size fits all. We're talking about lot sizes here, and actually for your information, we have a white paper on the topic of lot sizes. If you're interested, you can find it on our website. We'll send the link later. And Cyrille, I'll give you the floor.
Next, we get into the topic of planning. So we understand that our demand is variable. We understand that our processes are variable. But how can we come up with the best possible plan from that? And here, obviously, most of you here in attendance already do planning, are already faced with these types of challenges. We at Insight believe that having the right tools there is definitely the key to success in coming up with the best plan for you. But we would also encourage you to take that reflection a little bit further. So we're aware that we're working in a constantly shifting environment. So this is something that we have to be aware of. And that obviously makes the planning job a lot harder, a lot more challenging, and sometimes a lot more frustrating. And I think this is something that you have to be aware of. And in the face of that, you kind of have two options and two choices that you can take. Either you take the easy road and say, the planning is not going to work anyway. I'm just going to do my best. And then when things get out of hand, I'll just figure out how to make it happen. That's option A. The option that a lot of planners end up not having the choice to any other choice but to choose because they don't have time. They have a lot of programs to manage. They're overworked, and they don't have the right tools to help them with their planning. Option B is the option that we at Insight try to push with all of our pharma partners. It is an option that requires a little bit more time up front, but we truly believe that this constantly shifting environment increases the need for planning, and that spending more time up front, making sure that you understand your program, that you understand the world that you'll be facing over the next years, the types of constraints that you're working under. Are they self-imposed? Are they actual constraints of the program? What type of buffers are we deciding to put, not at an individual level, but in a global sense, and understanding that it's not just me computing my demand, then adding a buffer, then passing it on, and that person trying to figure out how to add buffer on top of the buffer that I already put. but really understanding what is the right place to keep the buffers, what gives us the most flexibility, reactivity to changes as well. So that's what we would recommend ahead of time, spending time building and understanding your plan in the most optimal way. But it shouldn't stop there. What we would also encourage you to do is to stress test this plan. Understand what this plan truly allows you to cover and what it should allow you to cover or not. Be prepared and everyone be aligned on what we cover and what we don't cover. And if we don't cover stuff, if there is a risk of things not going as planned, we should be aware of it and ideally have a mitigation plan in place of how we will react in case this risk does happen, because things always end up not working exactly as we had planned. And in our experience, it's a lot easier having these discussions when the things haven't happened yet and people are a little bit more level-headed about what is the most ideal decision-making process, rather than when everyone is scrambling around to figure out how to save the program. So again, it does take more time up front, but it saves you a whole bunch of time down the line and a lot of sleepless nights as well. So again, maybe food for thought. Every situation is obviously very different in that sense. And again, there's no one clear one-size-fits-all answer to achieve that. But we've been building that experience, and it's definitely something that you should always have on your mind when coming up with a plan to supply your trials. And so we wanted to give you a little bit of a case study there, and didn't want to be too obvious there of just another plan. It's a little bit more optimal, again, saving millions like we do all the time. We wanted to take something that's a little bit that you might not have thought of, and hopefully we nailed it there. But we focused here on stability planning. And so if you take stability planning in a program, typically we just get that as an input and work around it and figure out how to supply our program with that information. But with this partner, we work very differently. And again, maybe something that you can put in place here is that we really wanted to find what the most optimal stability testing plan was for a given program. And it wasn't the easiest program. So it's not like they just said, we don't really care about this one. Just figure out the stability plan if you want, and we'll make it happen. As it tends to be, it was very unpredictable demand, very high buffers all over the place that were needed to supply that. So definitely was a pretty interesting program there. And we had to figure out, what do we do in terms of stability? And we essentially have two directions that we could take. So either we went for something with very frequent stability pools. The advantage there, obviously, is that we can bring new shelf life data more quickly to the studies, and the shelf life increases more quickly and in a more linear way. It ensures that if we package new drugs or fill new DP, depending on how your own processes are, you always have the latest expiry possible and the best expiry possible. It brings the overages of the studies down. It's definitely positive for the supplies of the trial. But it obviously comes at a cost, because you need to plan drug for that. You need to spend time, resources in assessing the quality of the material after that given point in time. And so what do we do? So that was option one. Option two, obviously, is going the other route of very spaced stability pools, cheaper, but it's cheaper in terms of stability, but is it really cheaper overall? And so we did a lot of analysis, tested out, had a lot of fun figuring out what the most optimal plan was. In the end, we kind of converged to a situation where we had frequent stability pools in the beginning, and then they started to space out towards the end. When you're in the early stages of your stability, one more month means a whole lot more than when you already have 18 months of shelf life, and it really showed in the data that we were able to bring. And thanks to the fact that we had this tool supporting it, we could also put a number of exactly how expensive it will be, how much waste it would be, what is the risk associated with such and such strategy. And in the end, with the one we recommended, we were able to show that it was forecasted to require 30% less waste, or to generate 30% less waste in the phase 1 and phase 2 studies part of the program. So great. That's a success in and of itself. Where it gets even more interesting is that things didn't go as planned, as they tend to do in the clinical programs. And after a certain point, we didn't get the expiry extensions that we had. The good news is that that was also part of our initial analysis. We wanted to figure out, we're planning for all these great expiry extensions, but what happens if we don't get them? Will we have enough drug? Will we be ready to react and to adjust the plan, and how will we do it? So that's an analysis that we had done. And even though things didn't really go as planned, we were able to very quickly readjust without a whole lot of fuss and screaming matches or anything like that, and to get the program back on track. So again, it's just an example among many of a very small piece of the planning that can potentially have a pretty big impact. Here we're again talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of impact that this small decision had, and typically people don't necessarily think of challenging that, but it was definitely worth the day or two that we spent along with them figuring out what the right choice was, because it saved them a lot more down the line.
All right, thank you. And we're this is leading us to the last part of our presentation. I think we've been hinting at this throughout the entire presentation, but something that's very important when trying to make effective, efficient waste minimizing decisions is to work in collaboration. Something that we've experienced a lot is having conflicting information. People have received information, start planning for it. It's been updated. They don't know yet. Someone else knew, didn't tell them. It's really, really difficult to have a global view on everything that's happening and all of the assumptions that are taken on the end-to-end clinical supply chain. It's also really hard to know what other people are working with. And that links a little bit to the lack of communication, perhaps, in between teams. We've had the case of DP managers who they receive a clinical demand forecast from one of the supply managers, and they don't understand, what's the level of overage they've added? Is it really safe or not? Are these colleagues going to come in a month and change everything? So I'm also going to add a buffer on my end. And then they pass it on to the DS team, and they don't know either. So we've seen a lot that, and actually the larger the companies are becoming, sometimes the more silos are created, in the sense that it's different teams working on different parts of the process and making decisions without always the same level of information at the same time, and not always in alignment. And the more teams we had focusing on this, it's also really hard to have a global optimum, because everyone is trying to do their best and focusing on their own KPIs, making a local decision that seems the best. And there's not always the way to take a step back and understand, is this actually the best if I'm looking at my end-to-end process? And focusing on certain individual, let's say, KPIs can sometimes lead to inefficiencies. So we have a last quick case study here that might talk to a couple of you in the audience. Let's take the example of a study manager. We can call her Emily. Her objective is really to safely supply patients with minimal study overage. And on the other side, she has one of her colleagues, DP manager, who has an objective to really try and have a minimal DP budget with no impact for patients. So overall, it seems aligned, But what happens if they have basically a DP batch that's left over and that is going to expire very soon? If I'm taking the case of Emily, our study manager, taking that DB patch and having it allocated to her own trial means that the drug might not be completely consumed by her patients. It's going to increase her overage. For her own KPIs, it's not very positive. Now, on the side of the DP manager, leaving that batch unallocated and in the inventory until it expires also is not in alignment with her goal. So here it might be an obvious case where if they talk the two of them together, they can find a global alignment and the global optimum. But what does that mean for Emily and her KPIs? And ultimately, who has the decision? It's situations that we face really on a daily or at least weekly basis, that there's not always communication and collaboration in between everybody and tools to make it happen either. I'll leave Cyrille conclude our webinar for today.
Yeah, so we wanted to leave you with a few take-home messages of maybe food for thoughts. This hopefully open your eyes a little bit about, well, first, how high the waste levels really are in clinical supply chain. That's a number that isn't really, that people aren't really tracking that much, and we feel that they should, and it's the first step to be able to go on a journey of improving it. Now, we wanted to leave you with a few more pointers there of where should it start and what are the four key elements that we would recommend that you work on more specifically with your organization. And it's something that we've done very successfully with a number of our pharma partners. So the first one is the accuracy and transparency of the demand. And again, I think I've said that a couple times already since the start of the webinar, but this is where it all starts. And it's not only about getting an accurate forecast, it's also about making sure that you make your trial designs that are somewhat supply friendly and account for the supply of drug and make sure that we are prepared for that as well, and make sure that we incorporate risk in there. The goal is not to reduce waste at the expense of increasing risk. It's kind of the opposite that we want to do, is to bring more control to your trials, therefore bring risk down and the waste down at the same time. The transparent piece is also pretty important. It's not just a question of I'm now giving this IMP demand to the person in charge of DP, and then I'll let him figure out what to do with that, and I'm not necessarily involved with what he does there. It has to be very much of a discussion together and an alignment, and there needs to be feedback there and flexibility in the processes. The second take-home message is prepare for the unexpected. And well, I think you probably saw it in how excited I am in talking about it. That's something where we see a lot of value there. Assessing the robustness of your plan, making sure that you understand what you're putting in place and not just hoping for the best. And that includes understanding how all the downstream part will take place, how all the upstream part will take place, understanding really where you fit in that whole process. And again, communication is key there as well. We would also encourage you to push for analytical decision making. So we've been in way too many discussions where 2, 3, 4 people had very diverging opinions as to how a certain situation should be tackled. And it was all just based off of their experience and their gut feeling about what the right path forward is. Again, putting a tool in place there that can really assess the impacts of such and such change, making sure you have this framework in place to be able to assess the right choice, the pros and cons of different decisions, is definitely a lifesaver in all of that. And there's a lot of data out there that you probably already have access to and that you are under leveraging. So we would definitely encourage you to find the best tool for you that can help with that, of bringing all that data together and making sure that you can benefit from it. Second sub point there is that this analytical decision making also really helps with accountability further down the line. It's maybe not something that all of you are facing as of now. We see it more and more with our pharma partners, is asking to justify, why do we have so much waste in our clinical supply chain? So understanding the rationale behind a decision, why did we take such and such of a decision, is definitely very, very valuable when someone comes back and says, why did you use only 60% of that lot that you manufactured 2 years ago? It can be a pretty tricky answer to give. And so definitely encourage you guys to do that as well. It can save you a lot of time digging through emails further down the line. And last, but certainly not least, it's kind of been throughout everything that we've been discussing here, is having this single source of truth and transparent communication throughout. It's very important that everyone is a true stakeholder in all the different parts of the supply chain, even though your focus might be only on a specific piece of it, but understanding what is best for the big picture, how my decisions will impact other people, how I will be impacted by the decisions of other people, is very key. There's way too much of a gray area there in a lot of organizations around exactly how the person right next to them really works, and does the data that he just gave me include buffers or not? How much buffers? Do I really need to bend over backwards to supply all of it, or is he already including 50% buffers on everything that he gives me? That's not the types of questions that you want to ask yourself. And so this idea of this single source of truth that is really end-to-end, from your patients all the way to your first step of manufacturing, is really, really key. And really tracking why are you making each individual lot is really, really helpful in making sure that you bring your waste levels down. So again, we don't have all the answers for you today, and just a few ideas of things that hopefully will trigger some discussions there. As you can see, we're both really, really passionate about it. So if you want to have a chat offline afterwards, you know where to reach us. And now we'll be moving on to the more Q&A piece of the webinar. I saw a few questions already come in, and Amaury will be managing that.
Thank you very much, guys, for this very nice presentation today. There are indeed quite a couple of questions that we receive. Let's start maybe with Denise's question. What is the underlying data set for this analysis?
Yeah, I think that one came in at the moment we were talking about the 85% waste level. So if I'm right in thinking that that's what you were asking about, Denise, it's actually based off of analysis that we did with 4 of our biggest pharma partners that each are part of the top 20, and a total, I think, retrospective of 760 trials as a whole. So the whole supply chain of around 760 trials is how we got to that number. It came down to around 85% on average. For all of them, it was between 75 and 89, I think, if my memory serves me right. So ballpark, it's still in the same range of waste. There was no clear way better one than the other starting off on this journey. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Cyrille. Indeed. Now there's a second question coming from Julie. How do you concretely bring this kind of change into an organization?
Yep, perhaps I can. So there's, we've been talking about a lot of different concepts, and so it takes a little bit of time, of course, to change the mentalities and ways of doing. So in terms of what, as Inside, for instance, we can bring, we have a tool, but we also have services. The way we've seen it really work well is to start off with one compound, identify what are the biggest bottlenecks, where you can earn the biggest value, and then understand from that one compound the key learnings and apply them to your other compounds to grow. So it is a little bit of a journey, if I can put it that way. But yeah, at least at Inside, we have a production app, the supply app, as well as accompanying services.
And it's really a journey, and you have to figure out what are the key wins that will really resonate with people and build that momentum for change. The hardest thing to tackle is usually the status quo situation. That's why this number of 85% is definitely something that tends to open people's eyes as to how important it is to tackle that number.
And I think you also answered Jürgen's question about whether it was necessary to implement a tool to bring this kind of a change, so I won't ask it a second time. There was a question from Laurie about a specific slide that you presented, about the stability planning slide. What do you mean by soft replacement of site depot buffers?
I think I'm the one that talked on that one. The whole idea is that when you have longer shelf lives, it's a lot easier to have expiry overlap between your different lots. And so what does that mean? It means that there's a smoother replacement of kits as they are used by patients, that are replaced by fresher kits more naturally. If you have a very short shelf life, or if you make the decisions to have very little overlap between the expiry of lot 1 and the release of lot 2, then you end up having all your buffers just expire at once on the same day. Overwhelms, well, first, it's a pretty big waste in and of itself, because you have all that material expiring at the site level. But it also ends up overwhelming your depots that have this huge influx of demand that they have a tough time supplying, and it obviously snowballs all the way up your supply chain. So typically that's really where having the longer shelf life can help in smoothing out these expiry replacements.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, because it's also interesting here, we talked about the stability part of that. Now, if you have very frequent testing, but in terms of your packaging strategy, it's not coherent with that, then you wouldn't be able to have that smooth replacement. So that's really where if with a spreadsheet, for instance, it's very complicated to make decisions because all of the elements are linked with one another. And yeah, the tools that we work with really help you model all of the different elements that need to be considered, that have an impact on one and the other. So it's really end to end. So yeah. Great.
And very quickly, let's maybe take one last question, and the remainder of them we'll try to reach out to you with an answer by email. What are the timelines for a typical optimization project like this one?
Yeah,
that came from Ali.
It's a tricky one that we get pretty often, but there is no one clear answer there. I think you can very easily and quickly, in a few weeks, a couple months, start getting a lot of value out of this change and be able to start that momentum to be able to truly bring the waste levels from 80% down to 30%. It's much more of a fundamental change of the way your organization probably works. It depends, again, on a number of factors. I think you all are aware that not every pharma organization is as dynamic and open to change as others. So that willingness to change is definitely a big part of it. And honestly, it's a never-ending journey. So we've been on it for a few years, and there's always with some of our partners, and there's definitely still things to gain there. But you can probably get most of the benefits within the first year, I would say, for sure.
Thank you very much, Cyrille. And I think now we've reached the end of this webinar. So I just want to thank everyone that joined us today for being there, for asking the questions and participating in the webinar. Thank you very much to our speakers, Cyrille and Pauline, for the great job today. If you have any remainder questions or you would like to set a quick discussion with one of us in the coming days, feel free to reach out to us. You've got our email addresses here on the slide. We'll also share the recording with all of you. And you've seen also a pop-up appearing on your screen in case you want to learn more about our new production app, so the manufacturing optimization solution we just released a couple of weeks ago. Thanks again, everyone. I wish you a very nice remainder of the day, and I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you.